And we're live. Good evening. It's
Hello.
Wednesday and it's the Dark Ozarks. Hey,
Hello.
Josh.
Hey, Lisa. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very hot July evening in the Ozarks. And
Yes.
along with the heat, we're talking about problematic events.
We are, of course, some might conjecture that Dark Ozarks itself, we are a problematic event.
Probably for some, yes.
And which is a lot of fun. And do love the fact that folks regularly share questions and sometimes encounter our definitions of Ozarks and Ozark borderlands. That is a subject that we are continually in discussion about, and something that I think is important to understand. And of course, it ties directly into tonight's topic.
Yeah.
Is that there is what could be described as the Ozarks culturally. We say essentially hillbilly culture. And that's certainly, many regions throughout basically 3 states. Those states being Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. You have the Ozarks topographically and geologically, which has very specific boundaries that typically surprise people, especially in how far north those proper boundaries go. And certainly
how far east and west.
How far east and west. I have found that the southern Ozark borders, which is essentially the Ozark Mountain region in northwest Arkansas, tends to be less contested. And I think that is because we have very clear, the very clear boundary on the far south with the Arkansas River, and in the southeastern edge of the Ozarks, it very notably drops into Mississippi River Delta around Hoxie. And so there's not, is it Ozarks? Is it not Ozarks? It's Ozarks. And then 10 miles later, it's River Delta. And so that right. is easier to define. Certainly for State of the Ozarks story coverage, we also include the Ouachita Mountains, which geologically is a separate mountain range and is actually a largely east-west mountain range that is of a much different age than the Ozarks. And the Ozark Mountains are actually, by a technical or geological terms, not mountains, but a raised upland plateau that has been exposed by many, many millennia of erosion. Our border areas that typically are unknown, contested, and questioned are on the north and up in your neck of the woods, the northwest region, where the Ozarks slowly transition or gradually transition into what was originally tall grass prairie.
Well, and I guess I kind of welcome that. I think it's kind of amusing because this area just was probably problematic. It has always been problematic and in different ways. So, I think people around here kind of relish kind of ruffling feathers. So.
And then, of course, what then confuses people, but I think it's very important to understand that culturally and geographically, no location exists in a vacuum. You can't just draw a fortress border around and everything historically or culturally happening in the Ozarks does not have a transition line elsewhere or points of crossroad. And so one of the things I think we've done that I've really enjoyed is the consideration of Ozark borderlands, this large swath of land that is historically or geographically associated with the Ozarks. And the idea that things happen, especially historically, and we'll discuss those tonight, things happening outside of the Ozarks, but then affecting things within the Ozarks, and things happening inside the Ozarks that affect things happening outside the Ozarks. So there's that cross transfer.
Well, and I think what people get all tied up in the geological definition of the region and forget that human beings and how we interact, how our culture and how we just mesh is much more fluid than, a riverbed or a bedrock.
And certainly the geological boundaries of the Ozarks were less understood and less defined in, say, the 1860s than they are today. And a lot of people even today are living inside the geological boundaries of the Ozarks and don't realize it.
That's true. And there are areas that, on the southern edge and western edge that in past generally were considered, people just considered them part of the region that now we would say geologically aren't necessarily. So
very, very true. Very, very true. And, areas that I think will, to a degree, figure into our discussion tonight, which is centered around the Civil War, that I think are incredibly fascinating. Borderlands or borderland towns include, but are not limited to, St. Charles, Missouri, Alton, Illinois, Hannibal, Missouri.
Yes.
And and then on the southern reaches, places like Pine Bluff, Arkansas, or Hot Springs, Arkansas, which are, again, we recognize these are areas that are outside of the Ozarks, but they are in some historically significant ways associated with the Ozarks.
Yes, there's connections, and those connections are not always what people think, and they're not always easy answers. So
that is very true. Very quickly, we have a sponsor to talk about it.
Yes, we do.
And always buying books in Joplin, Missouri.
Well, you have a couple there. I actually picked up a couple this week.
Did you? I'm jealous. Oh, very nice. Very nice.
I'll send you information. I picked up a few other things that will make you more jealous, but that's all right.
Very, very fair. I picked up a little light reading in The Magic Circle of Rudolph II, Alchemy and Astrology in Renaissance Prague.
Yes, that looks interesting. I want to read that sometime.
We can make that happen. And of course, Born Fighting, How the Scots-Irish Shaped America by James Webb. And
very fitting.
And while we're on the subject of the Scots, this is Sky.
Hey, Sky.
He's a sleepy boy. But
he's a sleepy boy, but he's new mascot.
He is. He might just be our new paranormal investigative dog.
Yes, and people might seem surprised at that, but actually I know a number of investigators who do have dogs that they bring. Dogs are sensitive to activity, and
yes.
I know people that have dogs that thoroughly enjoy investigating. We will stay awake long enough.
That's true. He may have to be a little bit older. He's only 9 years old.
Yeah,
but he is a sensitive soul. I can tell you that. So having had him about the house
will be a welcome added addition to Dark Ozarks.
Yes, and he is much quieter than Boo at the moment.
Yes.
So,
where do we want to jump into this?
Oh, I would like. I know we talked. I'm throwing out an idea to just completely change the rules of what our notes were, but jumping directly into a very specific painting that is in Bates County and painted by George Caleb Bingham. entitled Back Home, I do believe.
Oh, no,
And
actually, that's the other painting.
that's the other
Uh,
painting.
It is, what is the name of it? I think it's just General Order 11 is the title.
Okay.
Oh.
And this painting, historian Albert Kaskel described it as, quote, mediocre art but excellent propaganda.
Mhm.
And tell us about this, what this painting means.
Well, it's a depiction of the execution, the carrying out of General Thomas Ewing's General Order 11, which was very controversial. That when it was approved by President Lincoln, it was done so hesitantly with the orders that it not be carried out harshly. And it did not go well. It was a matter of trying to clear out the rural areas in basically 4 counties: Jackson County, which houses what is now Kansas City. Kansas City didn't quite exist yet, but and then Cass County south of there, Bates County, and portions of Vernon County, because the Confederate guerrillas, particularly Quantrell and Bloody Bill Anderson, were getting a lot of their support in that area. So the idea was, and it was escalating raids on both sides. And then, so once Lawrence was burned by Quantrell, 4 days later, this order went out. And one problem was that it did not discriminate against one side or the other. It's just, we're going to clear everybody out. So hopefully the guerrillas, don't have as much support. And it kind of backfired because they actually got more supplies from from farms where people had to leave and things like that. And so there were people who were shot and killed by soldiers, even while by a lot of accounts, even while they were trying to comply with the orders. And so the painting is a depiction of the order being carried out and people basically being run out of their houses and killed, etc. And yeah, there's a copy of it that it hangs in the Bates County Courthouse. Nothing provocative or problematic. I mean, it's one of those things that in times that people are very angry and bitter over statues and something, it's an interesting juxtaposition. The other painting that you started to refer to actually hangs in Pleasant, I think it's Pleasant Hills post office.
Oh, wow.
Which is it's a mural in the post office, and it's a depiction of people coming home after this, coming home to a smoldering, their farm being burned and everything's just smoldering.
Yes. And I think there's, that there's so many cultural ramifications of Order Number 11. One of them being that a lot of people did not come home. A lot of people, especially Confederate leaning, went to Texas, and in terms of families, basically said goodbye to Missouri. We don't want to come back, or we physically can't come back for whatever reason. And when you contrast that, this happening in the 1860s with maybe 15 years later, the very pro-union or pro-federalist sentiment, industrial boom that took place in much of the region, that it really creates strata of experience and very, very different layers of history that I think we would now associate with much larger passages of time, like maybe a generation between the two. In this case, it was about 15 years.
Well, and an interesting point with that too is Bingham, who painted the painting, he was not a Confederate. He was not a Southern sympathizer. He was a Union man,
Yes.
but disapproved of the tactics that were
Yes.
used with it. And in fact, warned Ewing that not to do it, or he would ruin his name in print and with a paintbrush. And
And
largely
certainly
successful on that point.
it's, it is something that I think to a large degree has been occluded in terms of the larger discussion, the national discussion with the war. And I think some of that could be racked up to the fact that it's, a small, comparatively very small corner of the larger war effort, etc. But I personally cannot help but think that it was a lot easier for Union historians to simply omit much of Missouri because the war included Order Number 11, as well as some other moments like the burning of Osceola that did not fit the heroic and valiant narrative that was being told at that point.
I mean, that's true. I mean, things happened here by the Union Army that for the most part did not happen except for Sherman's march to the sea, which
Yes.
was late in the war and was calculated to actually very similar purpose to, we are going to shut down any vestiges of industrial capacity and end the war. And in intention, that's what this started out as. It just did not go very well. And ironically, at the beginning, actually at the very beginning of the war, when we talk about 6 people in the 19th century, the future General Sherman was in St. Louis when the war first broke out. And we will actually be talking about that later. So
I think that's incredible. And speaking of St. Louis, I was just thinking about this the other day, that is certainly something that validated the Lincoln decision was, of course, the hope, and it was largely successful from a military standpoint, of containing the guerrilla war that was occurring, and the very deep concern that Missouri would be lost to the Confederacy. And of course, thinking about that, had Missouri fallen in totality rather than devolving into a guerrilla war, the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, would essentially have had an industrialized center.
It would have helped their capabilities, particularly while they still controlled the Mississippi.
Yes, and it
could have changed things. And so it's easy to say, I mean, Order 11 disrupted thousands of lives and atrocities happened. On the other hand, things could have gone a lot different if a strong stance wasn't taken. I mean, it was softened. It was then replaced. Ewing was replaced at the end of 63 with another commander who changed the order basically to only apply to Southern sympathizers, and they could remain if they took an oath of allegiance. Initially, Ewing's order was it didn't matter who you were cleared out of the rural areas. You had to relocate to the population centers or within a mile of a federal Army post, basically, so they could keep an eye on everybody.
Yeah. So, and this might be the sort of our concluding discussion, I'm not sure. for here on our live YouTube. And then, of course, we do continue the discussion in depth on Facebook, and then that Facebook Live will be uploaded a little bit later for viewing here on the YouTube channel. We do encourage everybody to like, share, click, subscribe, notify, the bell, the thing, all of those lovely icons and whatnot. That said, the issues surrounding the Civil War are still very contentious for a number of people, and in larger, somewhat sweeping ways and perspectives, they can be very understandably personal, despite the fact that so many years have passed. What I think that there's certainly, from a union standpoint, there can be or a overarching federalist national standpoint, a right and a wrong way to approach our history. And I think from a Confederate standpoint, there can be a right and wrong way to approach that history. And I think that many people who love Civil War history or in some way emotionally engaged by it do really look for the positive balances in that. But from a problematic standpoint, there's folks who don't.
Yes, and it's almost that about every 20 years, it's a new reckoning, trying to wrestle these questions, it seems.
And it, I think, is made especially difficult to parse through in many ways, because depending upon one's viewpoint, notable standout characters, standout personalities of the war can be cast simultaneously as heroes and as villains.
Yes, perspective has a lot to do with
it. It is, and something that I always enjoy about these kind of discussions, and is that there's something, I think there's something very powerful about looking at the available information and understanding that many of our heroes, understandably, if you were, so to speak, under the experiencing the aftermath of their difficult decisions, it's very understandable that you could look at them as villains. Very understandable. And that's certainly one side. We're looking at you, Abraham Lincoln. I'm right there from Illinois. I totally get it. I grew up literally in the land of Lincoln. The Galena Trail that he rode to practice law was 3 miles from my house. I grew up with field trips to Springfield, Illinois, to tour his home and see the tomb, and tour downtown Springfield, and of course New Salem, which I still have the cookbook from. Just saying. Come to think of it, that's actually probably my first cookbook that I ever got. I was 9, but it's a good cookbook. Shortcake, or the shortbread recipe, is excellent. So do I.
And the flip side of that is that, of course, I grew up in this area. My family goes back. I had ancestors fight on both sides. I have on my paternal side, I've got my grandparents each had a grandfather at Vicksburg fighting against each other. So I have sensibilities both ways, and I find it, I understand that being impassioned, but I think because I have such connection to both sides, I think I can set that aside for myself and just say, I understand where they were coming from. I understand where they were coming from, and everyone was, doing what they thought at the time was the proper thing.
Yes.
And it's a little, I find it a little arrogant too today to be so dismissive of the past, because I think if a lot of people were dropped into those situations and with all the context that the same people had, a lot of people might make decisions that they would find disturbing.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And it is, once you really contextualize the history and step into what sort of decisions, sometimes those decisions being on the ground, were, and in some cases the decisions that were being made from very, very lofty and authoritarian positions, whether from a state level or a national level. These were, in many cases, agonizing and decisions in which they even understood there were no, it wasn't going to be an easy win. This wasn't going to be, there were no perfect situations. They were in the middle of a very horrible and bloody war that that is simply a series of bad decisions in which one hopes for the best were being executed. At the same time, and I think we'll talk about places like Avila and some dead bushwhackers here and there and those types of things. There were also, and I think that this really speaks to the at times agonizing depravity of humanity, the capacity for men to commit truly reprehensible crimes against one another. That the destabilization, the cultural destabilization that took place during the war, opened the door for atrocities to be committed that have to be taken into account as well.
Well, and that on both sides, and I think that's one thing that often is glazed over, is that the problematic issues of the Civil War were not a Southern issue alone.
No, not at all. It and I would tend to posit that there's two. Speaking of problematic, so here we go. That there are two historical post-war narratives that are continuing to fuel this argument that we have, and at this point, it should be noted that these two narratives are old enough to count as culturally significant within their own right, and that they can be observed with a certain level of objectivity, and understood that there were goals in place for each of them. One that I think is very clear, but is a bit monolithic, is the post-war Union narrative that really, I think to a certain degree, exist within the space of saying, essentially, what have we done? I mean, we won the war, but at what cost? The thousands and thousands dead, and from a purely propaganda injected into a national narrative and a national educational system, saying across the board, this was a valiant war, and we're the good guys, and we're not, we're not going to belabor things like Order Number 11 in this process. The fact that narrative tends to be monolithic or embedded within an unconscious structure, I think then gives a lot of fuel to the counter narrative, which is the lost cause.
Yes, which most people don't realize is an invention of the Daughters of the Confederacy from the 1890s.
Yes.
But and I'm not picking one over the other, but I kind of mulled this over today too, thinking about it, that although the post-war Union perspective in some ways fueled the lost cause narrative, I think the lost cause narrative more came out of that honor culture, that pride of we have to have an explanation.
Yes, I agree.
And those that ascribe to the lost cause overlooked the fact that all of the secession documents stated that slavery was the reason that they were seceding.
Yeah.
And by that token, right or wrong, the Union narrative at least tends to be, it's enunciated in a way that can be charitable to the other side, that we are all brothers and both sides were valiant.
Mhm.
We just had the better moral position. And
Yeah.
then you get that knee jerk. I'm sorry, the lost cause, to me, the lost cause narrative it's a knee jerk honor culture reaction to that. And I'm not disparaging that because I come from honor culture.
Yes.
I mean, hundreds of years. So
Yes. And
so
I think that is fair. I think from a human standpoint, what we really see at the end of the war as tens of thousands of families were reeling with the reality of the loss
yes.
of loved ones. It really was a national grieving,
Mhm.
and a part of the grieving, a part of that process is to say, surely it had to have meant something.
Yes. On both sides. Yes. And
Yes.
I think that's where we get to this point. That might be a good jumping off point to go over and start our longer format. And
That sounds like a plan.
and
Works for me.
the extended format edition of this will be uploaded tomorrow evening for people if you want to hear more details and specific examples we're going to be talking about.
Sounds good. We appreciate everybody.
We appreciate everybody and have a good week. And we'll be back next Wednesday.
Sounds great. And I'll see you in a moment.
Okay. Bye, Josh.